Dear viewers, what would you do if someone asked you to risk everything you've worked for to help them? Today's story is about a deployed American soldier whose entire world changed when he received an impossible request from behind prison walls. This isn't just another story about breaking rules or crossing lines. This is about a choice that would test everything he believed in and transform two lives in ways neither could have imagined. Before we dive deep into this incredible journey, I want you to know that what you're about to hear will challenge how you think about justice, truth, and the power of one person's determination to do what's right. If stories like this move you, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. Trust me, you'll want to stay until the very end because this story has twists you won't see coming. Let's begin with Craig Bryan, a 38-year-old soldier who had spent his entire military career following every rule, every protocol, every procedure to the letter. He wasn't one of those soldiers who bent the rules or looked the other way. Craig was different. His fellow service members respected him because he treated everyone with dignity, whether they were fellow soldiers, civilians, or even prisoners of war. He had this quiet strength about him that made people listen when he spoke. Craig had always dreamed of serving in the military. Growing up in California, he watched his father serve as a Marine for over 25 years. He taught him that being a soldier meant more than just wearing a uniform. It meant standing up for people who couldn't stand up for themselves. It meant being the barrier between chaos and order. Most importantly, it meant never compromising your integrity, no matter what. After graduating from basic training with top honors, Craig started his career at a military base in San Diego. He worked security details, convoy operations, intelligence briefings, everything a young soldier handles. His commanding officers noticed him immediately. He was thorough, professional, and had this natural ability to de-escalate tense situations. Other soldiers started requesting to work missions with him because they knew he had their backs, but Craig's dedication to doing things the right way sometimes put him at odds with others. When he witnessed questionable behavior from fellow soldiers, he reported it. When he saw corners being cut on mission reports, he spoke up. When commanders tried to pressure him into handling situations differently, he stood firm. This earned him respect from some, but it also made him enemies. The breaking point came when his direct commanding officer, Colonel Boswell, started engaging in corrupt contracting deals. Boswell was a man in his late 50s who had been with the military for over 30 years. He had connections, influence, and a reputation for getting his way. When Craig discovered irregularities in supply contracts and reported them through proper channels, Boswell didn't take it well. He started making Craig's military life difficult, assigning him to the worst duties, the most dangerous missions, and constantly questioning his reports. One afternoon, Boswell called Craig into his office. The conversation started professionally enough, but quickly turned threatening. He made it clear that Craig's career advancement depended on being more cooperative with him. When Craig refused and made it clear he would continue reporting the corruption, Boswell smiled coldly and told him he was making a big mistake. 3 weeks later, Craig received deployment orders. He was being assigned to a military detention facility in Nevada, 6 hours outside of Los Angeles. The official reason was staffing needs, but Craig knew the truth. Boswell had used his influence to punish him for standing up to him. Instead of fighting the transfer and potentially damaging his career further, Craig accepted it with dignity. He packed his things and prepared for a completely different kind of military service. The detention facility was nothing like the base. The moment he walked through those heavy steel doors, Craig felt the weight of the place. The air was thick with tension, the sounds were harsher, and the atmosphere was filled with an underlying current of danger that never went away. This wasn't about protecting and serving the nation anymore. This was about maintaining order in a place where hope often went to die. Craig's job was to supervise detainees during their daily activities, escort them to different areas of the facility, and ensure security protocols were followed. He quickly learned that being a detention guard required a different set of skills than being a regular soldier. Here, you had to read people differently, understand the unspoken rules, and maintain authority without escalating situations unnecessarily. Most of the detainees fell into predictable categories. There were the angry ones who challenged authority at every turn, the broken ones who had given up on life, the manipulators who tried to work the system, The quiet ones who just wanted to do their time and get out. Craig treated them all with the same professional respect he had shown everyone throughout his career. But after his first month at the facility, one detainee caught his attention in a way he didn't expect. Her name was Anne Jeffrey, and she was different from the others. Anne was serving a death sentence for espionage and treason. Unlike most detainees, she carried herself with quiet dignity. She was polite to staff, helpful to other inmates, and never caused trouble. There was something about her that didn't fit the typical profile of someone awaiting execution. Anne was in her mid-30s, well-educated, and had worked as a cybersecurity analyst at a defense contractor before her conviction. She spent most of her time in the facility library, reading everything she could get her hands on. Other detainees respected her because she helped them write letters to their families and assisted with legal paperwork. The guards generally liked her because she never gave them problems. Craig first noticed Anne during meal supervision. While other detainees talked loudly, argued, or ate in silence, Anne would sit quietly reading a book or writing in a notebook. She was always respectful when he gave instructions, never tried to engage in inappropriate conversation, and maintained appropriate boundaries. But there was something in her eyes, a sadness that seemed deeper than just being incarcerated. Over several weeks, Craig began to notice small things about Anne. She would sometimes stare out the windows during yard time with a look of profound regret. When she thought no one was watching, her composed facade would slip, and he could see the pain she was carrying. During mail call, she never received letters, never had visitors, and seemed completely isolated from the outside world. One evening during his rounds, Craig found Anne sitting alone in the common area, staring at a photograph. When she saw him approaching, she quickly put it away, but not before he glimpsed what looked like a family photo. That's when he realized that beneath her calm exterior, Anne was carrying a burden that went far beyond her criminal conviction. The next day, during a routine cell inspection, Craig discovered something that would change everything. Hidden in Anne's personal belongings, he found a carefully organized folder containing documents, letters, and what appeared to be evidence related to her case. When he confronted her about it, Anne's response caught him completely off guard. She didn't deny having the materials. Instead, she looked directly at him and said something that would haunt him for weeks to come. She told him she was innocent, that she had been framed by her former employer, and that she had one last wish before her execution date arrived. She needed someone on the outside to help her prove her innocence. But more importantly, she needed someone to fulfill a promise she had made to her dying son. Craig stood there holding that folder, knowing that what happened next would define not just Anne's future, but his own as well. Anne's words hit Craig like a physical blow. He stood frozen in her cell, the folder trembling slightly in his hands. Everything about this moment felt wrong, dangerous, like standing on the edge of a cliff, knowing one wrong step could destroy everything he'd worked for. But something in Anne's voice, the quiet desperation mixed with dignity, made him stay and listen. She told him about her son, Nathan, who had been only 9 years old when she was arrested. Nathan had been battling a rare heart condition, spending more time in hospital beds than baseball fields. During her trial, while lawyers argued about classified documents and national security breaches, Nathan's condition had worsened. Anne had made him a promise during one of their last visits before sentencing. She promised she would prove her innocence and come home to take him to see Yellowstone National Park, something he had dreamed about but never experienced. Nathan had died 7 months into her sentence. Anne never got to fulfill that promise, never got to say goodbye properly, never got to show him the geysers and wildlife he had only seen in nature documentaries. The guilt was eating her alive. But there was something else. Nathan's father, Anne's ex-husband, had received threatening messages after the trial. Someone wanted to make sure certain information stayed buried, and Anne believed her former employer was behind it. Craig found himself asking questions he never intended to ask. Why hadn't her lawyer pursued these leads? Why hadn't the evidence been presented properly? Anne's answers painted a picture of a legal system that had failed her, of corporate lawyers who had outmaneuvered an overworked public defender, of witnesses who had suddenly changed their stories or disappeared entirely. That night, Craig couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about Anne's story, about the folder of documents, about a little boy who had died while his mother sat in a cell awaiting execution for crimes she claimed she didn't commit. He told himself this wasn't his problem, that getting involved would be professional suicide. But every time he closed his eyes, he saw Anne's face when she talked about Nathan. The next morning, Craig made a decision that went against every instinct he'd developed as a soldier. During his off-duty hours, he drove to the nearest public library and started researching Anne's case. What he found in old newspaper articles and court records made his stomach turn. The case had been rushed through the system. Key witnesses had recanted their testimony after the trial. The company Anne had worked for had been investigated for security breaches multiple times, but somehow those investigations had always been dropped. Craig spent his days off digging deeper. He contacted investigative journalists who had covered corporate espionage, spoke with former employees of Anne's company, and slowly began to piece together a pattern of corruption that went far beyond what Anne had been accused of. The more he learned, the more convinced he became that Anne was telling the truth. But investigating was one thing. Acting on what he'd learned was something entirely different. Craig knew that helping a detainee in this way could cost him not just his career, but potentially his freedom. If he was wrong about Anne, if this was all an elaborate manipulation, he would lose everything. But if he was right, an innocent woman was going to be executed while the real traitors walked free. The breakthrough came 4 months into his investigation. A former company director dying of stage 4 cancer and wanting to clear his conscience reached out to a journalist with evidence of the cover-up. Digital files, encrypted communications, and recordings that proved Anne had been framed. The director had been pressured to falsify security logs that made Anne appear guilty, while the real espionage had been orchestrated by senior executives selling classified information to foreign governments. Craig knew this was the moment of truth. He could take this information to the authorities through proper channels, but that would take months or years to work through the system. Or he could take a more direct approach, one that would require him to step outside his role as a detention guard and become something he'd never been before, an advocate for justice operating in the shadows. He chose the harder path. Working with the journalist and the dying executive, Craig helped coordinate the release of the evidence to multiple news outlets simultaneously. He used his position at the facility to document Anne's exemplary behavior, to gather statements from other detainees about her character, and to build a case for her innocence that couldn't be ignored. The story broke on a Thursday morning. By that evening, Anne's case was front-page news across Nevada. The company executives who had framed her were arrested. The corrupt officials who had covered it up were under investigation. And Anne Jeffrey, who had spent 4 years on death row for crimes she didn't commit, finally had hope again. But Craig's involvement hadn't gone unnoticed. Military officials launched an internal investigation into how sensitive information about Anne's case had been leaked. They suspected someone on the inside had been helping her, and Craig knew it was only a matter of time before they connected the dots back to him. The night before Anne's conviction was officially overturned, she asked to speak with Craig privately. They met in the facility chapel, a quiet space where detainees often went to find peace. Anne thanked him for everything he'd done. But then she made another request, one that would test Craig's commitment even further. She asked him to help her fulfill the promise she'd made to Nathan. Not the original promise about proving her innocence, but a new one. She wanted to establish a foundation in Nathan's name to help other children battling serious illnesses, particularly those whose parents were facing legal troubles. She needed someone she trusted to help her navigate the outside world, to be her partner in building something meaningful from the ashes of her destroyed life. Craig looked at this woman who had lost everything, her son, her freedom, her reputation, and yet still wanted to use her experience to help others. He realized that fulfilling Anne's last wish wasn't just about clearing her name or seeking justice. It was about transformation, about taking pain and turning it into purpose, about honoring the memory of a little boy who had never gotten to see Yellowstone. As Anne walked out of the detention facility, a free woman the following week, Craig knew his own journey was just beginning. Craig stood at his apartment window 5 days after Anne's release, watching the sunrise paint the Nevada sky in shades of gold and pink. His phone had been buzzing constantly with calls from military administrators, internal affairs investigators, and reporters who had somehow gotten his number. He let them all go to voicemail. There were bigger things happening now, things that mattered more than protecting his career. Anne had called him the night before. Her voice sounded different outside those prison walls, lighter somehow, but still carrying the weight of everything she'd been through. She'd found a small apartment in Reno and was slowly adjusting to freedom, but she wasn't calling to talk about herself. She wanted to move forward with the foundation they'd discussed, and she needed his help to make it happen. Craig had spent years following orders, working within systems, trusting that institutions would do the right thing. But watching Anne's case had taught him that sometimes the system fails, and when it does, individuals have to step up and fill the gaps. He made a decision that morning that would reshape everything about his future. He submitted his discharge papers from the military. His commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Levin, called him into his office that afternoon. He was a decent man who had always treated Craig fairly, and Craig could see the disappointment in his eyes as he read the discharge request. Levin set the papers down and looked at him directly. He told him he knew he'd been involved in the Jeffrey case, that the investigation had found evidence of his research activities. But he also told him something Craig hadn't expected. He said that in 25 years of military service, he'd rarely seen a soldier show the kind of integrity Craig had demonstrated. He couldn't officially condone what he'd done, but he understood why he'd done it. Craig left that meeting feeling a mix of relief and terror. He was walking away from steady income, benefits, and a career path he'd worked hard to build, but he was walking towards something that felt more important than any military pension, the chance to be part of something that could make a real difference. Anne met him at a coffee shop in downtown Reno the following week. It was strange seeing her in civilian clothes, sitting across from him without bars or guards or institutional protocols between them. She looked older than her 35 years, but there was something in her posture that hadn't been there in detention. Hope, maybe, or determination. They talked for hours about the foundation. Anne had already been in contact with several hospitals and research centers. She'd spoken with lawyers about the legal requirements for establishing a nonprofit organization, but what she needed was someone who understood investigations, someone who could help identify families who needed support, someone who could navigate the complex world of military and legal systems that often left families feeling helpless and alone. Craig found himself saying yes before he'd fully processed what he was agreeing to. Maybe it was the way Anne's eyes lit up when she talked about helping other families avoid what she and Nathan had gone through. Maybe it was the realization that he'd spent his entire career trying to serve justice, and this felt like the purest form of that service he'd ever encountered. They spent the next 4 months laying the groundwork. Craig used his savings to cover living expenses while they applied for nonprofit status, developed program guidelines, and reached out to potential donors. Anne threw herself into the work with an intensity that was almost frightening. She would stay up until 2 o'clock in the morning researching funding opportunities, writing grant applications, and reaching out to medical professionals who might want to partner with them. Craig worried about her sometimes. He could see that she was channeling all her grief about Nathan into this project, and he wondered if she was dealing with her emotions in a healthy way. But he also recognized that purpose was powerful medicine, and Anne seemed to draw strength from the idea that her son's memory would live on through their work. The Nathan Jeffrey Foundation officially launched 7 months after Anne's release from detention. Their first case came through a referral from a social worker at Children's Hospital of Nevada. A single father named Mike was facing bankruptcy while trying to pay for his daughter's treatments for a rare autoimmune disorder. His ex-wife had been arrested on embezzlement charges, leaving him to handle everything alone. He was overwhelmed by medical bills, legal paperwork, and the constant fear of losing his child. Craig drove to Mike's apartment on a Saturday morning, bringing groceries and a folder full of resources the foundation had compiled. He sat at Mike's kitchen table, helping him organize medical bills and insurance paperwork, while 7-year-old Eve played with dolls on an old couch. The girl was thin and pale from medication side effects, but her smile reminded Craig powerfully of the photographs he'd seen of Nathan. That evening, Craig called Anne to update her on the visit. He could hear the emotion in her voice as he described Eve, how she'd asked if he wanted to see her artwork, how she'd told him about wanting to be a veterinarian when she grew up, so she could help sick animals. Anne was quiet for a long moment after he finished talking. Then she said something that made Craig understand the true depth of what they were doing together. She told him that for the first time since Nathan died, she felt like she was keeping her promise to him. Not the original promise about proving her innocence, but a deeper one about making sure other children didn't have to face what he had faced alone. Over the following year, the foundation grew beyond what either of them had imagined possible. They helped dozens of families navigate the complex intersection of medical crises and legal troubles. They provided financial assistance for treatments, connected families with pro bono legal services, and created support groups where parents could share their experiences without judgment. Craig discovered he had a gift for this work. His military background helped him cut through bureaucracy and advocate effectively for families dealing with overwhelmed social services systems. His natural empathy made him someone parents trusted with their deepest fears and most desperate needs. He found himself working longer hours than he ever had as a soldier, but feeling more fulfilled than he'd ever thought possible. Anne had transformed as well. The broken woman he'd met in detention had become a passionate advocate who could speak to corporate executives and medical professionals with equal skill. She testified before state legislative committees about the need for better support systems for families facing medical crises. She spoke at conferences about criminal justice reform and the importance of second chances. But it was the quiet moments that meant the most to both of them. The phone call from a father whose daughter had completed treatment successfully. The graduation photo from a teenager who'd beaten cancer while his mother served time for a mistake she'd made years earlier. The thank you letter from a family who said the foundation had helped them hold on to hope when everything else seemed lost. One evening, almost exactly 2 years after Anne's release, Craig was working late at the foundation's small office when his phone rang. It was Anne, and her voice carried an excitement he hadn't heard before. She'd just gotten off a call with a major medical technology company that wanted to partner with the foundation on a new program, providing free medical devices for children whose families couldn't afford them. As Craig listened to Anne describe the partnership opportunity, he realized something profound had happened. They had taken the worst experiences of their lives, her wrongful imprisonment and his professional exile, and transformed them into something that was changing other people's lives for the better. Anne's last wish had evolved into something neither of them had imagined when they first started working together. The little boy who had never gotten to see Yellowstone was now helping other children navigate storms of their own. And the soldier who had risked everything to help a prisoner was discovering that sometimes the most important orders are the ones written in the human heart. But their story was far from over. Craig sensed that Anne was building towards something even bigger. Something that would test both of their commitments in ways they hadn't yet imagined. That something bigger came sooner than either of them expected. 4 months later, Craig received a call that would test everything they had built together. It was from a federal investigator in Sacramento, someone he had worked with years earlier during his time at the San Diego base. Special Agent Deason's voice was tense as he explained the situation. A major investigation had uncovered a network of corporate espionage that went far beyond Anne's original case. The same defense contractor that had framed Anne was now facing federal charges for systematically selling classified information to foreign governments, covering up security breaches, and using their legal connections to silence anyone who threatened their operations. The investigation had revealed a pattern of targeting whistleblowers, destroying evidence, and eliminating witnesses. But there was a problem. Several key witnesses had disappeared or refused to testify, terrified of the company's reach and influence. The prosecutors needed someone who understood the company's methods, someone who had already proven they were willing to stand up to powerful interests. They needed Anne to testify, not just about her own case, but about everything she had observed during her time working there. Craig could hear the fear in Anne's voice when he called to tell her about the request. She had spent 4 years on death row because of these people. She had lost her son while fighting for her innocence. Now they were asking her to put herself back in the crosshairs of the same forces that had destroyed her life once before. The decision wasn't just about Anne's safety. If she testified, it would mean stepping away from the foundation during its most critical growth period. It would mean reliving the trauma of her conviction, facing hostile lawyers who would try to discredit her, and risking everything they had built together. But it also meant the chance to prevent other families from going through what she and Nathan had endured. Craig found himself in a familiar position, caught between the safe choice and the right choice. He could encourage Anne to focus on the foundation, to protect the good work they were doing, and avoid the risks of getting involved in another legal battle. Or he could support her in taking on a fight that was bigger than both of them, one that could expose a system of corruption that had destroyed countless lives. They met at the small park where Anne often went to think. The same park where she had scattered Nathan's ashes after her release from detention. As they sat on a bench watching children play on swings and slides, Craig could see Anne wrestling with the decision. Her hands were shaking slightly, and he recognized the signs of someone reliving traumatic memories. Anne told him about the nightmares that had started again since the investigator's call. She described lying awake at night, remembering the feeling of being completely powerless as her life was systematically destroyed by people who saw her as nothing more than an obstacle to their profits. She talked about the guilt she still carried over Nathan's death, wondering if things might have been different if she had been more careful, more strategic in how she had tried to expose the company's wrongdoing. But then Anne's voice changed, becoming stronger and more determined. She told Craig about a conversation she'd had with Mike the week before. Mike's daughter, Eve, was now stable and healthy, thriving in school and looking forward to getting her first puppy. Mike had thanked Anne for everything the foundation had done for his family. But he had also said something that stuck with her. He told her that the foundation's work was important, but the real gift she had given him was hope. Hope that good people still existed, that someone would fight for families like his when they couldn't fight for themselves. Anne looked at Craig and said something that made him understand the true measure of the woman he had chosen to partner with. She told him that Nathan would have wanted her to fight, not just for other sick children, but for all the families who were facing powerful enemies they couldn't defeat alone. She said that testifying wasn't just about seeking justice for what had happened to her. It was about preventing future Nathans from losing their parents to corporate greed and systematic corruption. Craig felt a familiar sensation, the same feeling he had experienced in Anne's cell 2 years earlier when he first decided to help her. It was the recognition that some moments define who you are, and backing down isn't really an option when you understand what's at stake. He told Anne he would support whatever decisions she made, but he also shared his own perspective. During his years in the military, he had seen too many cases where the powerful escaped consequences, while ordinary people paid the price for their crimes. He had watched families destroyed by systems that were supposed to protect them. Anne's testimony could be the key to breaking a cycle of corruption that had been operating for years. More importantly, Craig reminded Anne of something she seemed to have forgotten in her fear. She wasn't the same woman who had been railroaded 4 years earlier. She wasn't alone anymore. She had allies, resources, and a platform that could amplify her voice in ways that hadn't been possible during her original trial. The foundation had given her credibility and connections that would make it much harder for her enemies to silence her. Anne agreed to testify. The months leading up to the trial were intense and exhausting. Craig found himself serving as Anne's protector, advocate, and emotional support system all at once. He coordinated with federal prosecutors, helped prepare Anne for cross-examination, and worked with security experts to ensure her safety. He also kept the foundation running, delegating responsibilities to staff members and volunteers while maintaining the programs that families like Mike's depended on. The trial itself was a media sensation. Day after day, Anne sat in the witness stand describing a culture of corruption that had prioritized profits over national security. She testified about classified information that was sold to hostile foreign governments, about employees who were framed for raising concerns, about a systematic effort to cover up evidence of espionage that had compromised military operations and endangered American lives. Craig watched from the gallery as Anne faced down the same lawyers who had destroyed her life years earlier. But this time was different. Anne was prepared, supported, and armed with documentation that couldn't be discredited or explained away. When the defense attorneys tried to paint her as a disgruntled former employee seeking revenge, Anne calmly pointed to the foundation's work and asked why someone motivated by revenge would spend her freedom helping children and families rather than pursuing personal gain. The jury deliberated for less than 7 hours. Guilty verdicts on all major charges, prison sentences for the executives who had orchestrated the espionage, financial penalties that would fund victim compensation and enhanced security protocols for years to come. But for Craig, the real victory came in the weeks following the trial. Phone calls from other whistleblowers who had been afraid to come forward, now emboldened by Anne's example. Letters from families who had lost loved ones to corporate negligence, thanking them for proving that justice was still possible. Invitations from other organizations who wanted to partner with the foundation to expand their work to new communities and new causes. Standing in the foundation's office 8 months after the trial, Craig looked at the wall where they had hung photos of all the families they had helped. Dozens of smiling children, grateful parents, success stories that had emerged from some of the darkest moments in these families' lives. In the center of the wall was a photo of Nathan Jeffrey, the little boy who had never gotten to see Yellowstone, but whose memory had inspired waves of change that were still spreading outward. Anne appeared beside him, following his gaze to Nathan's photo. She was different now than she had been even a year earlier. The fear was gone, replaced by a quiet confidence that came from knowing she had found her purpose. She told Craig that she had been thinking about expanding the foundation's work, maybe establishing chapters in other states, maybe developing new programs to address the intersection of medical crises and legal troubles in underserved communities. Craig smiled, recognizing the tone in Anne's voice. It was the same tone she had used when she first described her dream of helping other families avoid what she and Nathan had experienced. But now her dreams had the weight of proven success behind them, and the resources to make even bigger changes possible. As they stood there planning the future, Craig reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He had started as a soldier trying to serve justice within established systems. Then he had become a detention guard working to maintain order in a broken institution. Finally, he had found his calling as an advocate operating outside traditional structures, using his skills and experience to fight for people who had nowhere else to turn. Anne's last wish had been simple in concept, but profound in its implications. She had wanted someone to help her prove her innocence and honor her son's memory. But fulfilling that wish had required Craig to risk everything he had worked for, to step outside his comfort zone, and to discover capabilities he never knew he possessed. The foundation was thriving, but Craig knew their work was far from finished. Every day brought new calls from families facing impossible choices. New stories of people caught between medical crises and legal troubles they couldn't navigate alone. Each case reminded him that Anne's original wish had evolved into something much larger, a commitment to ensuring that no family would have to face these challenges without support and advocacy. Dear viewers, sometimes fulfilling one person's last wish becomes the beginning of something that changes countless lives. Craig Bryan thought he was helping one innocent woman clear her name and honor her son's memory. Instead, he discovered that true justice isn't just about following rules or working within systems. Sometimes it requires individuals to step outside their roles, take risks, and fight for what's right, even when the odds seem impossible. Anne Jeffrey's last wish wasn't just about proving her innocence. It was about transforming pain into purpose, turning personal tragedy into a force for positive change, and ensuring that a little boy's dream of seeing Yellowstone would live on through the lives of other children who needed someone to fight for them. Their story reminds us that the most important promises aren't always the ones we make to the living. Sometimes they're the ones we make to memories, to principles, and to futures we may never see but hope to make possible for others.